I sing for all that you've done for me.
Lord, again, we remember what Randy was talking about in the lives that were lost 15 years ago in New York and Pennsylvania and at the Pentagon. And we just pray that you would, again, minister to those people who are still remembering those lives that were lost and grieving that loss. Lord, and I pray for the men and women in our military and in different government organizations who are working day and night to protect us from that happening to us again. And I just pray that you would be with them and encourage them. And I pray for their families as they work, that you would just help them have balance and that they would come to know you and find faith in you. And we just thank you for the fact that we can have confidence that no matter what happens to us in our lives, we are going to spend eternity with you. And so Lord, we look forward to that and pray that you give us grace and strength to face each day. We pray this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Well, we've been talking about Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 and 18, and I've been doing a series of sermons on conflict. Should I have anyone who has not had a conflict raise their hand? Anybody who's never had a conflict, raise their hand. Oh, get out of here, Robin. You and I are going to go right at it right now. I can settle that for you right now. Yeah, kick it. Leviticus 19, 17 and 18 kind of lays out for us the Old Testament solution for conflict. How Moses, through the law, taught the children of Israel to deal with conflict. It says in Leviticus 19, 17 and 18, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." Talked about that. What it means to hate. What do you do when somebody else hates you? "You shall surely rebuke your neighbor." We've talked about that and how we are to confront and the different ways we can confront. I've been using these tools. I don't know if you have or not in the last couple of weeks, but I've been using these tools. I confronted somebody yesterday, and they had no idea I was confronting them. It was awesome. Confronting starts with asking an indirect or a direct question, using the words how and what as the basis of those. And so if you remember our conversation yesterday, the person I was talking to, you'll notice that I used the word how to begin that conversation. And then moving into the direct question, which is what's going on, what have you done? And then from there, providing the evidence of whatever it is that the thing is that you're confronting the person for. And then listening to reason, explanations about what they say happened. And if they have a plausible answer for what you think happened that disagrees with your interpretation of it, then you let it go. If it is that they actually did do what you're accusing them of doing, then hopefully they're going to offer you a sincere apology. Never use the word "but" in a sincere apology, because when you do, it is not a sincere apology. Just, "I'm sorry, you're right, I shouldn't have done it." End of conversation. If you do that, you will be a star apologizer for the rest of your life. Okay? So, then he goes on in verse 17 and says, "And not bear sin because of him." Now the word "bear" is to lift your hand in retribution. You know what the word retribution means? It means to pay back, to lash out at somebody. So you are not to hate your brother, your neighbor. You are to confront them, and you are not to bear sin because of them. Retribution because of them. Pay them back for what you've done. That's how we sin in conflict, is when we are forced to pay. Actually, I believe we are. If we don't resolve a conflict, we cannot help but pay the person back for what they've done to us. And that harkens to, sorry, I shouldn't have used the word harkens to. It's the only word I can think of that fits. It points to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25, 26, and 27. "Be angry do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your wrath, neither give place to the devil, right? Paul was echoing that same sentiment here, that by dealing with conflict, we do the right thing. And if we don't deal with conflict, we are going to sin as a result. And he gives us the ways in which we can sin in verse 18. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And again, that statement, how many of you have ever heard that before? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know if you realize it, but it's in the context of conflict. This is the only time that statement is made in the Old Testament, and it's in the context of conflict. I do not believe that you can be loving and angry with somebody at the same time. You just can't. If I'm angry with somebody, I'm not going to be loving toward them. So unresolved conflict keeps you from loving and leads you to sinning. All right, and I have an example of this. We're going to look at the story of Absalom, David, and Ahithophel. You want to say that? It's like Chereseth. It's Ahithophel. He was a guy in the Old Testament. But we're going to jump. Okay, so just last week we talked about how Nathan confronted David, right? That was when he was 49 years old, when he had the affair with Bathsheba, right? And killed Uriah and married his wife and had a child. It was all a terrible thing. So Nathan confronted him and he repented. And then this is 16 years later. So he's 55 years old, right? So he was 49 and then he's 65. Pardon me. I went to Round Lake, right, Al? All right. He's 65 years old. All right. So David had several children, and some of those children, one of them was named Amnon, and another was named Tamar, and another was named Absalom. Absalom and Tamar were brother and sister by the same mother. Amnon was by a different wife, and because you had multiple wives back then. I don't want to talk about that, but that's the way they did it. So Amnon violated his sister, half-sister, Tamar, and so Absalom hated, the Bible says Absalom hated Amnon for that. And he waited for 2 years, did nothing for 2 years, just bided his time, and then after 2 years, worked the situation out when everybody else had forgotten about what was going on, wasn't thinking about it. He set up a scenario in which he could kill his brother. And he did. Killed his brother Amnon. So then he fled to a town in Syria called Geshur. And he was there for 3 years. Of course, David was unhappy about this. And so Absalom went to Geshur for 3 years. And then after 3 years, Joab, his general, got him to let Absalom come back to Jerusalem. And so he was in Jerusalem for 2 years, but in that 2 years, he never saw his father. His father never saw him. So he didn't see his father for 5 years. And I think Absalom was angry with his father because he didn't do anything about Amnon violating his sister. And so when Absalom came back after 2 years, they got together again, they were friends again, and they were a family, right? And so I think in David's mind, he thought everything was fine. Have you ever thought that? Everything is fine. That can be one of the most dangerous places to be in your life, thinking everything is fine, right? So after all of this happens, and we're already halfway through the sermon time, in 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 6, it says, after this it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. He didn't have a humility problem. He had no humility. And now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate in Jerusalem. And so it was when anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision that Absalom would call to him and say, hey, come here a minute. Where are you from? And they'd say, I'm from this tribe of Israel. And Absalom would say, look, your case is good and it's right. But there's no deputy here of the king to hear you right now. I'm sorry. Why? Because he was there early in the morning, before everybody else was doing business. He would get there early, and he would talk to these people. And then Absalom would say to them, "Oh, that I were made a judge in the land. And everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, and then I would give him justice." Of course, he would say that to the next guy who came 15 minutes later, who was the enemy of the guy that he just said it to, right? It wasn't about giving anybody justice. And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, because he was the prince, right? He was of the royal family, that he would put out his hand and take him up and kiss him. Sounds like a political maneuver, doesn't it? Right? I mean, kissing babies. We still do that today. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all of Israel, who came to the king for judgment. And here it is in verse 6. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Flattery, lies, trying to build loyalty, to steal the loyalty that they had toward their king and take it for himself. Now, the observation I want to make there is that just because David thought the conflict was over didn't mean that it was, right? David thought everything was fine. He thought they would reconcile, everybody was happy, everybody was doing the same, come together in peace and harmony. But there wasn't anything that was farther from the truth. So that's actually just the setting. We're going to move into the conflict of the story. In verse 7 it says, "Now it came to pass after 40 years." Now here's a conflict for you. Obviously, Absalom didn't do this for 40 years when David was 65, because we know David didn't live to 105. It's I believe supposed to say 4 years. After 4 years, so this is the 5 years that he was gone and hadn't seen David. Now 4 years later, he's building and working and taking his time, gaining support. Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord," bringing God in it, sounding spiritual, knowing what to say, the right things to say to make himself look like he's a good person. In verse 8, "For your servant took a vow while I dwelt in Geshur in Syria, saying, if the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve him." And the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron." And with Absalom went 200 men invited from Jerusalem, and they went along innocently and did not know anything. That's how these things build. They get people who are unaware to participate. Then in verse 12, Absalom sent for Ahithophel. There he is, Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, from Gilo, where he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. And it's in verse 13, "A messenger came to David then, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Obviously somebody in that camp didn't buy into it and let David know what was going on. So David said to his servants who were going to Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So they got everybody ready, and they moved out, and they were moving out of Jerusalem. And they went down into the valley, up into the mountain. You know what mount I'm talking about? The Mount of Olives. And he turns around and he looks at Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and he's weeping for Jerusalem. He's weeping for the betrayal of his son and his most trusted counselor. So the observation I want to make in the conflict is that David's most trusted companion turned against him. His most trusted companion turns against him. So let's move on to the crisis stage. I might actually get through with this today. This is awesome. Are you with me? Am I going too fast? All right, so you've got David. He's moving out, and he's got a lot of people with him. Hundreds of people are moving out of the city with him, and it's not an easy deal to get out of Jerusalem to get over to the Jordan River, which is where they're headed to get on the other side of the Jordan. so that they're not in Israel. So they have to go up the mountain, they have to go, through Bethany, and then down the long ravine down to Jericho, into the valley there. It's a long journey. So David is going, and then someone says to him in verse 31, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And I think that just invoked this fear, because it says later on that in verse 23 of chapter 16, it says, the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both to David and to Absalom. So Ahithophel he was just this crazy wise person and knew exactly what to do to succeed. And that's why he was the king's advisor. So when David heard that Ahithophel had gone over, he said in verse 31, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. So David prays to God because he knows that with Ahithophel on Absalom's side, there's no way he can win. Because Ahithophel is so wise, so strategic in his thinking, knows exactly what to do to succeed and conquer David and his followers there. But at this time, John was talking at men's breakfast yesterday, which was awesome. And those breakfast burritos, we had men's breakfast yesterday. Somebody brought breakfast burritos. They were so good that my wife was telling me my breath smelled bad even last night after I brushed my teeth. So I want to thank whoever it was that made those. They were delicious all day long.
Too much garlic and
No, I think it was hot sauce or something. Hot sauce. So John was talking about timing and how he had worked it out so he got at the grocery store just at the right moment to see somebody who he hadn't seen in a while and invited to the men's breakfast, and then they came to the men's breakfast, and how God worked at perfect timing in that situation. That's exactly what's here. So David finds out that Ahithophel is on Absalom's side, and he is terrified. He's praying his heart out, asking God, please God, do something to negate the counsel of Ahithophel. And then all of a sudden this other guy walks up just as he's doing that, and his name is Hushai. Who in the world would name their child Hushai? I have no idea. But his name was Hushai, and he was the Archite. And so he comes up and he wants to go with David. And he says, I want to help you and support you. And David says, no, I have a better plan. Why don't you stay here and you join Absalom and pretend like you're loyal to him. And then when Ahithophel gives his advice, then you give him different advice. And we'll pray that God uses you to confuse Absalom so that we are not defeated by the advice of Ahithophel. And so he does that. Hushai comes back to he must be having a really good time at children's church out there. So he comes back and he swears his allegiance. I don't know how he did it, but he promised that he would be faithful to Absalom, and he joins with them. And Zadok the priest and his sons go, and they join with David. So David's putting these other people into the mix there to be able to find out what's going on and to confuse the counsel of Ahithophel. So in 2 Samuel 16, verses 15 through 23, Absalom comes into the city with all the people of Israel, and they join them there with Ahithophel, and Hushai was there with them. And Absalom asks Ahithophel, what should I do to gain power now that I'm in Jerusalem, the capital city? And listen to the counsel of Ahithophel. In verse 21, Ahithophel says, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. Now, you know what this is. This is retribution. This is the consequence of David's actions 16 years earlier when he had the affair with Bathsheba? Where was David when he saw Bathsheba?
On the roof.
On the roof of the house. And so Absalom goes and takes all of David's concubines up on the roof of the house and has relations with all of them. And it says, this is what it says in 2 Samuel 12, 11 and 12. You remember this, we talked about this last week. This is what Nathan told David would be the consequences of his actions. He says, "Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. And I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun." This is a consequence of David's sin. David repented, but there were still consequences for what he had done. So David's political conflict, I think, this political conflict was the hardest battle he had ever fought. You know, he'd been fighting people for years. He'd been defeating everybody. Everybody he fought just fell before him. But I think this particular battle he was facing was one of the hardest ones he had to face because it was a political conflict. And David's political conflict was hard for him to navigate because it was being fought with unseen battles for loyalty. That's how how this battle was being fought. Unseen battles for loyalty. Who would be on whose side and who would gain the upper hand in this power play for the kingdom. So, Ahithophel, after Absalom is done, comes to Absalom and says, "Okay, now this is what you have to do. Let me choose," now this is interesting, "let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak, and make him afraid, and all the people who are with him will flee, and I only will strike the king." What does this sound like to you? Personal grudge. There's a vendetta there. There's something David has done to Ahithophel that he's been holding on to, this grudge he's been holding on to for years. And so now he's got this opportunity to take vengeance against David. And he wants to kill David with his own two hands. And then in verse 3 it says, "Then I will bring back all the people to you. When all return except the man whom you seek, all the people will be at peace." And the saying pleased Absalom and the elders of Israel. And then Absalom said, "Okay, sounds good, but I want to talk to Hushai." So he talks to Hushai, and he says, "Hushai, what should we do?" And Hushai says, "Well, you know, if it were me, I wouldn't do this deal with Ahithophel. You're going to get yourself in some serious trouble because the people who are with David, those are mighty men. Those are fierce warriors. They're not going to run away. And then you're going to have a slaughter of these 12,000 people who are going to kill all of the followers of David. And everybody's going to be upset and say Absalom is a murderer. He's a massacre person. He killed all these people ruthlessly. And then you're going to be in a lot more trouble if you do this." And so it says in verse 11, "Therefore I advise that all Israel be fully gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba." Dan is all the way to the north, and Beersheba is all the way to the south. "Like the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him there shall not be so much as one." And if he goes into a city, we'll throw grappling hooks, and we'll tie ropes, and we'll pull the walls down, and we'll kill everybody in it. Sounds like a John Wayne movie or something, right?
Yeah.
So look at verse 14. "So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel. For the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel." Ahithophel's advice was good advice. It would have won the day for Absalom, to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. God was working within the conflict. God was working within this conflict that David was facing. So, the resolution, how does it all come out? Well, Hushai goes to Zadok the priest and says, hey, send this message that Ahithophel has told the king that he should go and attack him immediately. So tell the king to get on the other side of the Jordan. And so they all move across the Jordan, and they get to the other side. And in verse 23, it says, in 2 Samuel 17, I'm cruising today through the scriptures. Are you keeping up?
Yep.
2 Samuel 17, verse 23. It says, now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey and arose and went home to his house, to his city. He put his house in order, and he hanged himself and died. And he was buried in his father's tomb. He was totally defeated. He knew it. And he knew. Ahithophel was he was still no dummy. He knew God's working in this situation. Absalom's going to die. Everybody with Absalom is going to die. I might as well choose the terms of my own death. I'm going to die. And he hanged himself. And he died. And so in this instance, in this conflict that we're not going to go to the end, obviously it all ends well for David, except for the fact that his son is killed. Absalom is killed in the military conflict that follows because he followed Hushai's advice. He gathered the army, they had this huge battle, and then in the midst of the battle, Absalom was killed. And so David is terribly grieved because whose fault is it? His fault, because he sinned. He killed Uriah's wife, and he stole her, or killed Uriah and stole his wife and had a child with her. And so God, this was a part of the punishment that God had for David, and he knew it. So this time, though, the right side won in the conflict. It doesn't happen all the time. There are many times when the wrong side wins in a conflict. So I have some applications I want to point out to you before we wrap this up with Ahithophel. Okay? Just because you think a conflict is over doesn't mean it is. I can't tell you how many times in my ministry where I thought a conflict was over when it wasn't. And I didn't find out until later. And let me tell you, I wish I had not deceived myself into believing that the conflict was over. Even your most trusted companions can turn against you, just like with David. Political conflicts are the hardest to navigate because they are often fought with unseen battles for loyalty. That goes within the church, it goes in the home, it goes in your job. That's just the way it is. God, however, God is working in the conflict. All right? It may not end the way you want it to, but God is still working in it to do what He needs to do in your life, in my life, to bring about the growth that He wants us to gain through this. And sometimes the right side in conflict wins. And my side is not always the right side. Sometimes I'm on the wrong side of the conflict. Right? You guys don't seem very convinced about that. It's true. It's true. And the point I want us to see from this story, one of the points is that many conflicts are a long time in the making. And when that's the case, they are harder to deal with because they're building and growing and things are happening you're not seeing, and then all of a sudden there it is, and you have to try to figure it out and resolve it in 15 minutes. And that is not happening. It takes work to resolve conflict. So, getting back to the original story of Leviticus chapter 17, chapter 19, verses 17 and 18, of you shall not bear sin because of him, you shall not carry out vengeance, you shall not bear a grudge, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ahithophel could not love David. He gave him good advice, but he could not love him in this context. Why? Because there was something David had done to Ahithophel that he had not resolved, the conflict he had not resolved. And so, through the years, he had carried this grudge against David. He was his servant, he had a job, he did the work, he came in, punched in 9 to 5, did his thing, went home on the weekends. But he had a grudge, and when the opportunity for vengeance came, he took it. What had David done to Ahithophel. 2 Samuel 11:3 says, So David sent and inquired about the woman, Bathsheba, and someone said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? 16 years later, 2 Samuel 23:34, talking about the mighty men of David. One of them's name was Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai, the son of the Maachathite. Now, I have no idea, when I get to heaven and I meet these guys and they say, you just ruined my name. It's okay. But here's the one we need to realize. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Eliam was the father of Bathsheba. Uriah the Hittite was Ahithophel's grandson-in-law. David murdered Ahithophel's grandson-in-law, stolen his wife, and caused the death of his great-grandson. And because he did not resolve that conflict, because he never went to David and said, you know what you did was wrong, and you should apologize to me, my family, and all of the nation of Israel, and face this thing, because he couldn't do that because he didn't rebuke David. He carried that grudge with him for 16 years until finally it ate him alive, and he had no other choice in the end, because God was with David, but to hang himself. The point I want us to see is that unresolved conflict keeps you from loving and leads you to sin. And there's nothing you can do to stop it if you don't do something about it. So, that's a commercial. That sermon was a commercial? No. This is the Growing Up in Christ Bible study. We're having a membership class. It's starting this afternoon at 4:30, and it's open to anyone. It's a membership class in that it leads to membership, but you don't have to become a member just because you go through this study. But in this study, it teaches you how to resolve conflict in a way that frees you from the burden of it in instances where the person will not or cannot give you a sincere apology. So I want to encourage you, if you still have time, I have one book left. The book is also on the website. You can download it and read it on a tablet or your computer or your phone or whatever. And I just want to invite you to it. But we need to be careful about how we deal with conflict. Because if we leave it unresolved, it's going to lead to our sin. And I don't want to sin. I do sin. But I want to do whatever I can to keep myself from sinning more. Right? So I'm going to continue to do that. And I challenge you to be serious about dealing with conflict. Learn some lessons and rebuke your neighbor. Nicely. Okay. Lord, we thank you that you have given us this command of how to have relationships. Lord, there are so many times when we have conflict. It's a part of life. And yet we have obligations and responsibilities and how we deal with it in a way that pleases you. And there are consequences that we've looked at in all these other situations, the consequences of these people's actions. Lord, there are consequences to us if we choose not to deal with the conflicts. So I pray that you would encourage us, Lord, to step up, to be willing to do what it takes to resolve conflicts that we can, and then to deal with the ones that we can in a way that pleases you. And I pray that you would just encourage us in our faith as we seek to be Christians who love